All right, so we're recording.
Okay.
Um, so, hello everyone. I'm really excited to introduce you today to our guest speaker. I'm introducing you to James Silveira. He's a licensed clinical social worker. He's a good friend of mine. We worked together probably 20 years ago, and he's kind of like a guru. Anyway, he's here to talk to us about his experience working with the vet center at the vet center. And so I'm going to have him, if he could, just introduce us to you, tell us a little bit about your educational background, and also tell us about your position at the vet center and what the vet center is.
Okay. Well, I'm a I'm a local kid, so I got my bachelor's in psychology from Stan State and my master's in social work at Stanislaus State as well. And I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, as Aaron mentioned, and then I'm the director at the Modesto Vet Center.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about what the vet center is, because I think a lot of people have heard about vet centers and they've heard about, um, there. I think your center is unique in some ways compared to like the typical vet centers that a lot of people hear about. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. So basically, the Vet Center program is we are, how would you say, like a subsystem. We're a part of the VA, but we're a part of the VA, but we're separate from the VA in a sense. But what we do is we specialize in providing readjustment counseling services to combat veterans and those who have experienced military sexual trauma. And we also do provide bereavement counseling. So if somebody loses a loved one while on active duty, we provide bereavement counseling services as well. And yeah, there's 300 of us throughout the country. Yeah, and then we just came into existence in 1979, and that was based on, specifically, it was to help Vietnam veterans. But as time went on, they've expanded it to everything that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So, for you said you talked to people who have like PTSD and so on, but also sexual trauma while in the military, and then bereavement counseling. So I'm wondering, are all of the people that you see at the vet center, do they specifically have to have had combat experience, or it can be anyone?
So it has to be one of those three. So it has to be either they experienced combat, so they served in a combat zone, or they've experienced military sexual trauma, or they've lost a loved one while on active duty, and we're providing bereavement counseling services.
Okay, got it. Cool.
We
So,
have those are few, the bereavement counseling cases. We don't have a lot of those.
okay. Um,
And I'll just mention primarily the cases are the people we serve are combat veterans
okay.
primarily.
Okay. All right. And when you say military sexual trauma, are you talking about someone who was assaulted while in the military, essentially? Is that what that means?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Got it. So thank you for that. So we have a good idea of your background, where you work. You're the director of services there. So you manage all of the clinical aspect, in other words, all of the clinicians that work there. And you also see clients, is that right? You still see
Mm-hmm.
clients? Okay.
Yeah.
So we're right now studying stress disorders and like acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And you said a lot of primarily the clients that you see are combat veterans. So what would be like a typical client that comes into the vet center? How would they present to you? When we talk about how they present, we've been talking a little bit about assessments and so on, and like how
Mm-hmm.
you're taking everything in to either create a diagnosis or do a full assessment of a client. So when you see someone come in, what would be like average or typical, presentation of someone who comes into your vet center?
Um, it's tough to kind of come up with just one cookie cutter. It varies. We have some who come in and they just come in and they're interested in services and discussing all that we do. provide, we're different from the VA and different from a clinical aspect that we obviously provide clinical therapeutic counseling, but we do a lot of socialization stuff. So we have socialization groups. We have, for example, guitar lessons. We have bowling groups. We have a Vietnam veteran has a passion for flying radio-controlled airplanes. So they developed a radio-controlled airplane group. Now, I think that's the beauty of the Vet Center working there is we can pretty much do what we need. And these socialization activities, as we'll talk about PTSD, a lot of things that can happen is this isolation and kind of bunkering down. And these socialization activities gives them opportunities to reconnect with others. But to answer your question, so we have some who come in and they just kind of come in and, they're just getting a feel, getting a lay of the land, kind of assessing. We have others who come in.
So they're coming in for an assessment, but they're assessing you and to see if they want to be there. Is that what you mean? Like they're let's check this out.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like they're coming in and they may sometimes say, well, yeah, I'm interested in kind of these services. Almost getting a feel like, can I trust you? What's the vibe of this place? Mm-hmm. Like that, for example. Mm-hmm. And then we have someone come in and they waited far too long to come in. That's pretty typical though too. And they come in and they're kind of like in a hurt locker. They're kind of hurting, and you kind of bring them in and kind of meet with them, start developing that. Well, it's that therapeutic relationship with them and that comfort level.
What is it? Sorry to interrupt you, but what would it look like, or how do you know they've waited too long? How do they know? What have been some of the impairments in their life or the suffering or distress that they've experienced that lets you know, man, this has gone on too long?
It's usually the relational issues. I mean, it's usually, my spouse has been hounding me to come in here for a long time. I'm finally coming in because it's now their relationship is really strained. It could be alcohol abuse, which is that one's pretty common because that's a part of military culture too. I'd say those are two of the biggies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you'll see people coming in who have been dealing with the symptoms of PTSD for too long. Is that what's been affecting their relationships?
Yeah.
Okay. And also impacting their substance use, possibly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just a part of military culture, unfortunately. It's a way, it's an unhealthy coping mechanism.
Right.
That then continues after they leave. Not always, obviously, but that can be an issue. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a maladaptive coping skill to mm-hmm. deal with those symptoms of PTSD. So what kind of, when we talk about PTSD, you did talk about the symptom of isolation or how people start to hunker down a little bit. They isolate themselves from other people. What other symptoms do you see with people who come in of PTSD? And how does that present? It's like, you and I know the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So what would it look like, when someone's hypervigilant, for example, or, re-experiencing the trauma? What's it like?
Yeah, I guess maybe the best way I'll do is, this is kind of how I, in general, explain it to a veteran when they come in. Mm-hmm. And I'll kind of do an overall. I typically hone in more on their specific symptoms that they're really struggling with. But to kind of start off with, I just start by explaining how we're wired physiologically. So I'll just kind of start from that angle and then tie into the symptoms, because it all pertains to that, really, actually. So our strongest will is our will to survive. We're going to do what we need to do to stay alive. We're biologically wired that way. And if we weren't, we would have died off eons ago as a species. So it's all about staying alive. So when you go into a war zone, your brain adapts to increase odds of survival. Because it's all about living. Because if you're dead, obviously nothing else matters. And one of the ways our brains adapt, we call it in the field hypervigilance, which is always assessing for potential danger, potential threats, being fully aware of your surroundings at all times. It's a great thing in war zone because it increases your odds of survival. The other one I'm going to tie into that and talk about these two together. The other is exaggerated startle response, which is when you hear anything that sounds like a potential threat. So the quicker you cover up, quicker you duck, quicker you drop to a knee, quicker you react, increases odds of survival. Those are great things in a war zone, like say, increases odds of survival. They're not so great as once you come back home, because the way our brains work is our brains don't say, okay, you went, like for example, with kind of hypervigilance. So let me kind of explain that first. Kind of crowds. So crowds. If you're in a crowd and you don't feel stress or anxiety, you're just a trusting person. You just trust that all these strangers, they're going about their business and they're not going to do you any harm. If you're a combat veteran and you've been to Iraq and you've dealt with crowds and whatnot, and you don't know who's a friend or a foe, who's an enemy, who's trying to kill you, who's not, coming home and coming into crowds can be incredibly dangerous and anxiety-provoking, because the way our brains work, we're just wired for survival. So our brains don't go, okay, crowds were dangerous in Baghdad, but they're okay here in America, because that doesn't increase odds of survival. The best thing to do to survive is to say, no, all crowds are dangerous. So when you come home, for some veterans, crowds can be incredibly anxiety-provoking because that anxiety and that fear is coming up, and it's always assessing for danger or threats. And in a crowd, you can't read everybody. You can't see everybody's hands. So that creates incredible stress. Another example is, go ahead.
Sorry, let me ask about that. So, it sounds like when they're in the war zone and they've been trained to be hypervigilant, it's a survival mechanism as well as just part of their training and part of what they do. So switching that off when they get in an environment that's not a war zone is really difficult in their brain-wise.
Exactly, yeah. And that's what creates, so it's really common for veterans, with crowded restaurants, may not go in. If they do go in, they're going to sit with their backs against the wall, so they have everything in front of them. So that way they're assessing for danger. They can see who's coming in and coming out of the restaurant. The interesting thing I'll just share now with everything going on with COVID-19 and the pandemic, I had one of my veterans say, this whole social distancing thing is great. I love this whole 6 feet apart. That way I can keep an eye on everybody. I don't get anybody too close to me. I don't have anybody like in the grocery store, like on my back while I'm in line. It's like, so
it's stressful for other people. It's stressful for other people, but for him, he's like, this is the best.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the same thing, like we get exaggerated startle response. Great thing in the war zone, not so great when you come home. This was a Vietnam veteran. This was still early when cars backfired, but he shared a story when the car backfired, and he was like under the kitchen table, just like that. And his parents were like, what the heck is going on?
Oh, wow.
Because it sounded just like a bomb. So it's those kind of examples. I had another Vietnam veteran share with me that he was walking through the park and the sprinklers just popped up and he immediately dropped to a knee. And these two people walking by and just kind of looked at him, and it's just that reaction to, it's all to increase odds of survival. So that hopefully kind of helps to explain kind of where the hypervigilance comes from, the exaggerated startle response.
So that'd be what you talk to your clients when they first come in, when they're there and they're assessing you and seeing, is this place going to meet my needs in their casual kind of a roundabout way. Then you kind of provide what we call psychoeducation around what's happening to them and what could be happening to them and why. So that sounds like it's really helpful. Are they like surprised to learn all this stuff, or have they had any education around trauma and the impact that can have based on their military service before?
Yeah, it's interesting. My experience is most haven't. As far as kind of connecting the dots and understanding why they're struggling with some of these symptoms. It's gotten better with the younger generations, but for Vietnam, Vietnam veterans, it was really eye-opening for them. We opened up here in Modesto in 2008, so I'm just trying to do the math real quick. So for some vets, that had already been 40 years since they had gotten out of Vietnam, and this is their first time coming in and for services.
Wow.
So for them, it was just kind of eye-opening. And for some of them, it was hard for them just to come in, period, because the way they were treated when they came home by society in general and the VA. So long as I am never going to anything that is related to the VA. And that's why the Vet Center program was developed kind of separately from the VA, because the poor experiences being on veterans received from the VA. So, so it depends really on the generation of the veteran too.
Okay. Yeah, how educated they are going into it. And if anyone is interested in learning more just about the Vietnam War, there's a really great mini-series, 10-episode series from PBS. It's actually on Netflix now. Just awesome if you want to educate yourself on the Vietnam War and how the veterans were treated when they came home. A lot of them, anyway, just that's a little side note, little side education. If you got time, watch it. It'll just be really educational for you. But anyway, back to our psychology that we're talking about. Okay, so they present with some of these symptoms. When you start educating them and saying, hey, you might be having hypervigilance, and that's because of this. You might be having that exaggerated startle response. That's likely because of this. When you start pointing these things out and they're like, okay, yeah, that's happening to me. Do any of them talk about flashbacks, re-experiencing the trauma that they have experienced?
Yeah, that's actually, I don't, not a lot. You get that sometimes, but I don't have a lot of veterans who do experience flashbacks. The main symptoms that I really see that for people who come into vet centers is the anger, and the poor sleep quality. I would say and nightmares too. Those are the biggies. So it's really kind of discussing those two. Maybe the anger is an important one to discuss, since it's so it's just so common. So basically, going back to physiology, you guys probably already talked about and learned about kind of like the freeze, flight, fight response. So that's how we're all wired. So when you're faced with a life-threatening situation, freeze, assess the situation. Flight, you run away, and the last resort, if that don't work, is fight. Military training, boot camp, is really about reversing those last two. They don't want you to run away from danger. They want you to run towards danger. So, so military training, I got to repeat that because that's it's kind of wild trying to reverse those last two, but that is the goal. And the best, probably easiest way to do that is to get people to get in touch with their anger. Because anger motivates you. It propels you to do something. Fear freezes you. And the last thing they want you to do is to freeze in a war zone. And not only not freeze, they want you to run. So it's getting in touch with your anger. So you run towards danger instead of away. So those are great things in a war zone. That's the point of military training, is training you. It's not so great is when you come home then. Because anytime you feel fear or anxiety, if your natural reaction is to come out in anger, that's going to create issues. Another issue that is created then is when you come out in anger is that it can be reinforcing. Because if you come out with anger, most people are going to kind of step away and step back. So then it works. It's reinforcing. They may later feel horrible for how they treated their spouse or their children or whoever, but it worked in the moment. And that leads to a lot of relational issues. And with PTSD, it really boils down to is an utter sense of loss of control of whether or not you're going to live or die, and that is incredibly terrifying. So life can be about always maintaining control, and I'm going to do everything I possibly can to always be in control. So anytime I feel fear or anxiety, I'm going to do what I can to get that control back. And what they've learned is you go to your anger.
Yeah.
So it's hard because one of conversations I have all the time with veterans is, the tools and the skills you learn to help you to survive in a war zone are really the exact opposite of what you need to have a successful relationship. Because what do we teach our clients? Okay, starting to feel anger. Okay, you need to take a break or take a time out. You need to walk away. You need to separate yourself. And it's like...
Right, anger, anytime you get angry, the communication stops. There is no more communication, which, doesn't help you get resolved. So, right, that's a complete opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. So there are so many, it's not even just the trauma that they've experienced in the war zone or, that post-traumatic stress, but it's also the residual effects of just their training overall to be soldiers, to be in combat. So, which then is causing them to stress otherwise. Because, when we're talking specifically about post-traumatic stress disorder, we're talking about you've experienced a life-threatening event and now you're traumatized by that. But it seems like even being in the war zone and being trained as a soldier can have effects that cause relationship problems or, interpersonal relationship problems that can impact work and everywhere else too. So.
And it can, and I don't want to kind of stereotype and say this is something that all veterans struggle with, because not all veterans do. So
right.
But yeah, these are the things that can come up and can happen, and that veterans can struggle with.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's great. I appreciate that. And we did talk a lot, or a little bit in a lecture today about resilience and some of the factors that, there are people who do go to war who don't come back traumatized. But but I think it's important to mention that they can come back with other issues that aren't necessarily related to trauma, but maybe related to training or just the mindset and switching from military to civilian life. So that's good. And, we have a lot of students at MJC who are veterans, and I think they'll really benefit from hearing that and, being educated about it, about all this process. So when we talk about treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, there are a number of modalities that come up. Talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. We talk about, I mentioned EMDR, which I know you're trained in and use sometimes. So could you talk a little bit about maybe how does treatment progress? What are some of the things? I know you mentioned, first you're educating them just on what post-traumatic stress looks like and how it impacts and so on and how their brains work. But are there certain modalities that work best for some of these clients?
So I'm going to start with kind of basic stuff, and this is something I always share. So, if this is a field you're interested in being a therapist, first and foremost, never underestimate the power of listening and caring, and just hearing a person's story and just being able to sit with them. I can't tell you how many times I've had veterans tell me, it's like, I've never told anybody that before. So a lot of things that can come up. Yeah.
It's so powerful to just tell somebody your story, whether it's a veteran or whatever. But yeah, that you're right. That's so powerful in therapy in general.
Yeah. And so if somebody has PTSD, and we're not just talking combat related, just in general, one of the key things is they're always assessing for danger. So they're always assessing for threats. And what they're doing is assessing, okay, are you somebody I can open up to? And are you somebody I can talk to about my demons and dragons? So that whole piece is, the whole piece of just kind of being there and listening and providing a non-judgmental space for them is huge because of the guilt and shame that can come up from war experiences. So that's huge. So that's kind of like the foundation. And then from there, it's really what the key points I go from there is really helping them is to calm the nervous system down, because that is that's huge, because they're just wound up and wound tight. Because if you're always assessing for danger or
they're stuck in that fight or flight mode.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So something I teach to virtually all the veterans I work with is deep breathing, and the vast majority have found that helpful. So it's just helping them to go from that shallow breathing that is further promoting a fight flight response to deep breathing that helps to calm the nervous system. Just making our breathing deeper, quieter, slower, more regular. Just getting to that kind of natural way of breathing.
It triggers
Then,
that. It triggers that nervous system response that calms the body. It
mm-hmm.
lowers the heart rate, lowers the blood pressure. That deep breathing, yogic breathing, all of that helps bring down that fight or flight response. It literally changes in your brain.
Yeah, exactly, and so that's a big piece of getting them when they are triggered by something of just being able to go to the breath before you do anything. Going to your breath, and a term in the military they use a lot is muscle memory. You do something so often it's just automatic, because obviously, so when you're in a war zone and be blunt, shit hits the fan, you don't freeze. You just go to muscle memory, do whatever your job is. So trying to teach them with breathing. So anytime you get triggered, just going to your breath. And then from there, then I look at other things if they're open to, like, meditation. It was interesting. I had one veteran, because I use a lot of solution-focused, strength-based approach too as kind of a foundation. I was just kind of exploring with him what things had worked for him in the past. And he said to me, he goes, "Oh, meditation, that was helpful. I have to go back to that." And that was really all he needed. I mean, he goes, now he spends 3 hours on the pillow, as he puts it. So he meditates 3 hours a day. He's a retired Vietnam veteran. So
wow, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of time meditating. I'm happy if somebody does 10 minutes. I'm like, that's great.
Yeah, so he's the poster child.
He's like floating off the floor already.
Yes.
Wow.
And he assured that was literally cured his PTSD, and he was infantry in Vietnam. And he shared an example, I'll probably share, he was going for a hike with family and friends, and they're all making noise, laughing and talking loud and enjoying the time. But it was triggering him because it was taking him back to Vietnam, being out in the bush, and he was starting to get angry, you guys all need to shut up, you need to be quiet. And he realized what was going on, and he was able to go to his breath, and then after a while was able to enjoy the rest of the hike.
Wow.
So this is somebody who's really taken it and ran with it.
Yeah.
The other one I mentioned, and the veterans are open to, is yoga. Yoga is really meditation and motion. And it's interesting, you get people at different phases of therapy. So I have one veteran who has a buddy who's also a combat veteran, and he found yoga so helpful. He goes, I'm not saying it cures PTSD, but it really helps a lot. And he ended up becoming a certified yoga instructor. But people are in different stages of therapy with this veteran who's open to yoga, but just hasn't gotten around to do it. So it's like this constant reminder with him, just give it a try. Work for your buddy. This can be something that could possibly work for you. So for starters, that's kind of, it's the, never underestimate the power of listening and caring, psychoeducation. It's the relaxation skills. And then once you get through those, then it's kind of different treatment modalities. So I found EMDR to be successful with people who have simple trauma, like one trauma. It's almost like a magic wand. It's fascinating. Which EMDR, simplistically put, is like bilateral stimulation. Which can be either a kind of here kind of tapping, but it's typically you use a light bar, and the veteran follows the light with his eyes while thinking of the trauma.
And the idea behind it is that the eye movement connects to the brain, parts of the brain, and essentially, right, dislodges wherever that trauma is stuck, wherever that part of the brain is stuck in that pattern of fight or flight. The EMDR, the movement of the eyes following the light bar, dislodges that somehow, and they're able to then work through it. Is that right?
Yeah, and it can be. And it's typically they've done the most research with the light bar, but it could be vibration or it could be sound, where you put like headset on and the sound goes from one side to the other side. Um, it is interesting. I mean, when, like I said, it's really successful with simple trauma, where this trauma that is so ingrained in their mind and it's like right in front of them in living color, that it just dissipates. It becomes like a long ago memory that they have trouble even seeing it, and it becomes less bothersome. And then for others, um, they remember other pieces. So it's kind of like this is the trauma, and this is all they remember, and now they remember all the details around it, which gives it complexity and more understanding, and helps them come to more terms with what happened, because they weren't remembering the whole story. So yeah, so when it worked, I had one veteran share. His brain was like, when you put up Christmas, when you put up Christmas lights, and they're all like all just cluttered together, and you got to strain them out. He goes, that's how my brain felt after MDR. Like, it was all kind of strained out. So
like the lights, you could see them individually rather than in a big ball.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Sounds pretty powerful.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, it can be. And then the other I use a lot is cognitive processing therapy, which is essentially looking at how our thoughts lead to how we feel and to how we behave, and kind of helping veterans to develop balanced thinking, and kind of seeing things from, I guess, in a complete way. Because one of the things that veterans can struggle with is kind of like these negative self-views, like I'm a monster, or I'm a horrible person, or the world is completely dangerous, or
kind of absolute thinking, black and white type thinking. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, a lot of all or nothing thinking. So helping them to see the shades of gray, and see the whole situation. Because that's pretty common with depression too. With depression, is you just see one side of the coin is just all negative, going down, and the idea is to see the flip side of the coin, and just to see the whole picture.
Right.
So there's a lot of cognitive processing therapy as well to assist veterans to develop balanced thinking.
Awesome. Well, I think that's very helpful. I think you've given us a really good picture of what it is to be a therapist in an environment working with people with post-traumatic stress. You've given us a good picture of a typical, presentation of someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, some things particular around PTSD and military culture, and also about treatment. So I just want to thank you so much for being our guest speaker here today. And anyway, I'll just give you a thank you from all of us, and we'll end right there. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. Thanks, James.